It is Monday once again, and for today's show, what I hope will be a rare occurrence. Me wearing glasses. Something's kind of up with my vision right now, so the eyes are getting a little break from context, but even still, I'm having a touch of trouble reading the script. I might not even know until later that I have read something wrong, but if I do, I'll probably leave it in. Anyway, this week, as announced, we are adding Girls Band Cry to the lineup, the winner of the community vote for a rewatch. Even though it released in the past, for the purposes of this show and the Discord discussion, we will go one episode at a time as if it was actually airing. Outside of that, we'll talk about the newest episodes of shows that we have covered already. Dan to Dan's 7th episode got the community in a buzz, so I have put it first, and then I will talk in turn about the latest from Blue Box, 365 Days to the Wedding, and RE0. I've been catching up on some other series as well, such as Mecha Uda, Ranma 1/2, and The Stories of Girls Who Couldn't Be Magicians, which I realize are all vastly different series from one another. Maybe I'll get a chance to mention them in the coming weeks. There's a few that piqued my interest from the previous show that I haven't even gotten back around to either, which is something that I hope to correct. For now, though, let's continue our discussion of Dan to Dan. So, Dan to Dan, Episode 7. And here I thought the rule was you chose Episode 5 or 8 for your mid-season standalone standout. Dan to Dan just doing things their own way again. Humanizing a character heretofore presented as a villain is a high-risk, high-reward proposition for a storyteller. If we think logically, we know that bad guys had reasons for their behavior that made sense to them, and we know that a traumatic enough event can bend a normal life path into a jagged one. Certainly with Hauntings, there exists an expectation that some awful event precipitated the state. But even as much as we suspend our disbelief in the experience of a story, some background part of us knows that a storyteller is in control, and has intentionally given us a limited perspective on a character. In other words, we know we have been set up, and this is certainly not the first time we've encountered the backdoor origin story, so you are fighting against the audience's cynical experience. It's high risk, but high reward, as there are many stories whose standout moments are the redemption or recontextualization of characters that we had previously rooted against. Sometimes when we're tricked, we're glad for it. Dan to Dan has one additional hurdle, though, which is tone. While every scene has a tone, the patterns of those tones as the story progresses creates an expectation in the audience. A few jokes don't make something a comedy, but if the majority of scenes are tonally comedic, you are certainly not in a drama. What's more, a good work contains a mixture, as the more seldom used tones can serve as counterpoint to the prevailing ones, making them seem stronger by contrast. It's similar to a roller coaster, where we don't actually feel speed, we feel acceleration. We feel the banks and loops, the changes. But likewise, if there's too much acceleration or too sharp of a turn, we black out. If a story veers too far too fast from where it was going, we are no longer on the ride. Dan to Dan has largely been frenetic and irreverent. That is its prevailing pattern, and what we would expect most from any random scene drawn out of a hat. But of course, it's not every scene. It has certainly leveraged tonal delta between scenes to good effect, such as when cutting from Momo and Okarun's heartfelt makeup session straight into Momo laughing at his continued misfortune. Or, in the opposite direction, having the defeat of the Turbo Granny Crab fusion shift into the reveal of the victimized girls comprising the location-bound spirit. That itself was kind of a redeeming the villain sequence, but it works there due to its rapidity. It's already happened by the time we could have braced ourselves to be skeptical. Easier to do it that way, short and sharp amid a field of crazy scenes and a premise that itself seems like a kind of joke. Like, remember where we were at the end of last episode. A two-faced girl gets bonked by a golden ball that's actually a stolen testicle and decides to perform an exorcism on a classmate in the belief that said testicle was a heavenly calling, when it's actually just the carelessness of something called Turbo Granny, which is currently trapped in a cat statue. Exactly how seriously are we supposed to take a story with that as its setup? So while the montages showing the origin of Acrobatic Silky are going to be the part of this episode that people remember most distinctly, I wanted first to emphasize that the audience must be stepped into it carefully. If that exact sequence runs at the beginning of this episode, it doesn't work as well. In fact, our adaptation leverages its medium to help the transition. The episode break itself puts some distance between Ira's antics and this week's story, and the episode opens with a short bit that foreshadows the backstory. We more readily accept that kind of non sequitur at the beginning or end of episodes, and it builds off of the brief flashback scene from before of Ira interacting with Silky in the past. We are primed to expect some explanation. And then, once Silky is seemingly defeated, we discover that Ira is not unconscious like we probably assumed, but dead. In fact, was dead all along. And that reveal is immediately followed by the opening credits, itself a tonal whiplash that almost makes the announcement into black humor. Either way, though, we have 90 seconds to sit with the idea of her death and wonder how that goes. Thus, on resumption, we have had what is basically a tonal palette cleanse. And the fact that she is really dead now sets the stage for a more serious and desperate mood to take over. The work to characterize our cast thus far now pays off. For as exaggerated as their antics can be, we've had plenty of sober and authentic moments alongside. This is not suddenly the first time they've been serious. However, this time the enemy isn't something supernatural, but the most mundane and natural thing of all: simple mortality. That contrast is frightening in itself. Momo has been pretty good under pressure to this point, and does immediately take charge, but there is a kind of hysterical edge to it. I love the choice of keeping her still handcuffed, as it adds to that sense of helplessness. She is a little more desperate than usual, and so we shift into treating the situation as that much more dire. Okaru is characterized as painfully shy and uncertain, struggling even to look at Momo after realizing that she's cute. Performing the breathing part of CPR on Ira should be several bridges too far, but he does so. It's not a setup for a joke, and thus we know the time for jokes is long past. And throughout, Turbo Granny relays the hard facts, with a voice that, for a change, isn't quite so mocking or caustic, just matter of fact. Even when Silky gets back up, Momo's reaction is one more of annoyance or defiance. No time for the otherworldly threat right now, something more serious is going on. The shocking violence of ripping her jaw as an olive branch diffuses any worry over changing gears, and Turbo Granny's authority on spiritual matters allows the aura connection to proceed. Even if tense and skeptical, they are willing to try any lifeline. And if we are hoping for a reprieve ourselves, it's perhaps more for the sake of Momo and Okarun than it is for Ira. She isn't exactly a beloved character at this point, and so we need to see their desperation to likewise be invested in their goals. They are the ones we are rooting for. And thus, has the audience been ushered to the right mental space to witness Silky's story. After watching the episode, I wandered over to our Discord to catch up on the conversation there, and part of it was about what I've already said, that the villain redemption thing happens a lot and it doesn't always land. The prevailing sentiment, though, was that this one did. But why? And in trying to quickly attach a word to the experience, the one I hit upon was sacred. It felt sacred. And I mean that two ways. One is that it is treated seriously by the work itself, with reverence in contrast to all of the irreverent moments that have come before. The scene has gravity, but it gets there through the careful mood shaping that leads into it, the things that we have already discussed. The other way I mean it is that the story itself is two stories, the one within the apartment and the one without, the sacred inner world separated from the profane outer. The series plays with light and color, as I've said before, and Silky is pink-themed. As she's a dancer, maybe we think of the soft pink of a ballet slipper, but our actual first image is the pink lights of a love hotel, with a timer and stack of bills to supply the reality. From there, it's a trudge through darkness and rain, and we first get a look at her face in reflection on the window that separates her from a recognizable dress, another pink, a goal and a barrier between them. She comes to her apartment, back into darkness, and pauses a while before entering. And maybe because of that, we expect that some other misfortune awaits. But instead, the door opens and warmth spills out, both light and love. She has a daughter, and this apartment is a sanctuary. After hugging and greeting, she goes inside, shutting the door and the rest of the world behind, and the ballet begins. I am not going to assume you know much about ballet, though you probably recognize a ballerina's look and dancing style. An actual ballet is something like a play. It's a story, but there are no lines of dialogue, only the dancer's steps and the score that accompanies them. Ballet is about exalting the human form and movement, and so paring it down to only this and music creates emphasis, something beautiful and dreamlike in its simplicity. Thus, too, this segment, which has no dialogue, only movement against music, and we must discern the story for ourselves. And, as I said, 2 stories. The outer, where she works multiple jobs and takes calls to make ends meet, and the inner, where she and her daughter are the whole world, a warm, bright cube of peace, in inviolable space. Out there, a timer marks the slices of her life she sells to Johns, but in here, a timer means a meal shared between parent and child, and in the midst, a decision. Money taken from an envelope, a circled date, and the gift of the dress. Then, like a ballerina itself, the camera spins through the moments of the last day, into a night that is not dark with storm, but resplendent with stars. Of course, we know some misfortune is lurking, and it is painful yet appropriate that it should happen within the sanctuary of the apartment. Dialogue returns, beginning with the child's anguished cries. The sacred space is defiled. The outer world intrudes on the inner, the dream shattered as surely as the glass which lacerates her skin. And after her child is taken, a second ballet, but something dark and desperate instead, cold blue rather than warm yellow, but maybe still beautiful, still dreamlike, until she dances off the edge and enters death mired in regret. At this point, we learn her connection to Ira, the teased bit from the previous episode. Perhaps her latent spiritual powers allowed her to see into the other realm and make this brief connection, and Silky replaces memories of her daughter with Ira instead. And maybe unexpectedly, we learn Ira lost her own mother, and perhaps that is also why she can briefly see Silky. In fact, it may be that both their trajectories were set around this time. As we learn, Ira was encouraged to become someone her mother could be proud of, someone strong enough to do it all on her own, and the result is the self-important girl that we have met so far. This, then, is the actual brilliance of the episode. We are redeeming acrobatic Silky, sure, but we are really redeeming Ira. It seems she and Momo both experienced the tragic story, and the surrender of her aura means Silky will end as something more tragic still, believing that she only brought harm to her daughter, that her life was unfortunate for being born to Silky. And hearing her fate, reduced to a void, forgotten by all, Ira plays the role of daughter for her. It's frightening and risky, and all a misunderstanding anyway, a stranger's twisted ghost. But she is touched, and gives what comfort she can, hoping earnestly that Silky be taken to some kinder world than this. And you see, we aren't on guard for an Ira redemption. It slips past our defenses, already in motion as we realize the possibility of halting Silky's fate. The image of Ira tear-streaked in an act of authentic kindness is a stronger one than that of a petty mean girl. The new supplants the old. We have been tricked, and are glad for it. So I think I have figured out what the title, Blue Box, actually means. It's a reference to the glacier that our romantic progress is trapped inside. Okay, actually, I love a slow burn, but it's at least a little funny to end last episode with a strong hint that it would be Chinatsu's turn to act jealous, only to have the payoff be her also just asking for a piece of chicken right at the very end, where it's not even clear if she was jealous of Hina or the food. I'm really sympathetic to Taiki's plight, trying to guess what exactly is going on in her head. That, at least, the episode does explore. I'm still rather amused at the work functioning primarily like a romantic comedy while borrowing the sports anime structure, but this episode does good work leveraging that fusion. We spend some quality time with the girls' basketball team for a change, as they enter the qualifying gauntlets themselves. It's nice to have Chinatsu characterized in the context of her teammates, and nice to learn that they are protective of her. We'd only had an outsider's perspective, that she was a star player and a popular personality, so for all we knew, the rest of the girls are jealous or resent her status. But no, they are a team and behave like one. It's a different dynamic compared to badminton, where they do compete directly, something that we will come back to. The key event involves a rival school at the same tournament who are keeping tabs on Chinatsu. They are likely to face one another and have done a little opposition research. By chance, Chinatsu and her teammate Nagisa overhear their analysis, and it's pretty dismissive. The most hurtful part, in fact, is the idea that Chinatsu has barely improved, a repudiation of the hard work we know she has been putting in. Nagisa basically gets angry on her behalf, but Chinatsu seems unmoved, and certainly it's not unusual for them to want to assess their opponents. When Taiki later learns about the exchange through some accidental eavesdropping, which he gets busted for, he'll want to try to encourage her. Don't pay attention to the detractors or mind what others say. The people that matter know you've put on the work, and so on, but she interrupts him. She does care. It does bother her, but only a clenched fist betrays this emotion. It only makes her more determined. If they win on the court, well, then they can't say those kind of things again. The lesson Taiki hopefully learns from this is that Chinatsu can pull a bit of a poker face when she really wants to. Maybe he's used to Hina's expressiveness, the way she wears her heart on her sleeve, though come to think of it, Taiki isn't too far behind. He may have been assuming that no outward signs of feelings from Chinatsu meant that they didn't exist, but he knows well that she is passionate about basketball. If she can keep such cool composure in this situation, then why not in other arenas? Granted, this seems more like he shouldn't be discouraged instead of any kind of specific encouragement, and that kind of ambiguous hint of direction is present in his part of the episode as well. His own test on the road to nationals isn't too far behind, and so Kyo wants to know if he will ask her out if he makes the cut. And at this point, he doesn't really know. The risk of making Chinatsu's living situation awkward is a real one, and just because he set the standard for himself to feel worthy of her, doesn't mean that she sees it the same way. Maybe she'd say yes either way. Maybe she'd say no either way. He wants to consider her feelings first before risking anything that would complicate her life. This uncertainty is echoed in his match with Haru. Like I said, in badminton, your teammates are also your opponents. Quite literally, in this case, where they are a team for doubles, but rivals for singles. And rivals might be putting it generously, at least until this episode. Taiki takes a game off Haru for the first time ever, and Haru will take the next, and this match takes so long that they have to call it quits before the end. The answer as to who will win is left hanging, just as surely as the question about Taiki asking Chinatsu out. What's more, Haru suggests that learning Taiki is capable of winning is to his advantage. If he'd lost a game for the first time in the tournament, it might have been a real shock. Now that he's forewarned, he'll be more on guard against Taiki if they meet in the qualifiers. A little bit of progress in this case doesn't necessarily mean Taiki should be more confident, and that's a lesson he might also apply to the dynamic between him and his crush. I do like that they suggest they'll put a pin in their match though, returning to finish it at some point. I'm imagining that we might get a different outcome in the tournament than we get in the conclusion of their little scrimmage match, and perhaps that will be something that spurs Taiki towards one choice or another. I didn't really know going in how this series would handle the sports-romance blend, but episodes like this really work for me, so I'm glad I've been keeping up. And then there's the opposite of Glacial. To preface this, as an introvert, I want to first express that it's bothersome when people assume that an extroverted personality is just what's needed to cure a social situation that I'm a part of. I'm not trying to be an extrovert, but failing at it, right? I engage with others to the degree that I want. It's just a smaller amount compared to many others. I'm not trying to get outgoing personalities to tone it down, or suggest that they should really spend some more time alone. Keeping to yourself is not, by itself, a problem to be fixed. That said, oh man, have we been overdue to have someone like Nao inserted into the story to rattle these two out of their comfort zones. Now I'm really just skipping right to the impromptu drinking party, something that is way out of the ordinary for Honjoji. In fact, no one else has ever even been in her apartment, so we are outside familiar territory before it even begins. Nao, it seems, is the work hard, play hard type, and they are both drunk in short order. Nao lowers the resistance to conversation with both her personality and the liquid courage, and Honjoji finds herself venting without too much prompting. Of course, Nao's presence highlights something else that has been confounding our two leads. She knows that their marriage is fake. They don't have to keep up the charade around her. Even though Honjoji is uncertain what the childhood friends may mean to each other, here is someone she can actually talk to about her own confusion. In fact, neither Ohara nor Honjoji have been shown to have friends that they can talk to, and they certainly can't be straight with their coworkers. Part of their problem is that they have no exterior sounding board for their uncertainties. They are trying to navigate this unfamiliar situation with only themselves for counsel, but it's pretty hard to ask yourself for advice. Of course, it's also hard to ask a drunk Nao for advice, so instead we get Ohara roped into the conversation just in time for Nao to pass out. With Ohara inbound and no Nao for support, Honjoji decides to drink a little more. Once he's there, Honjoji does her best to try to steer it towards something like clarity, and confesses that even though she has kept a policy of trying to switch emotions off, for some reason she can't switch this off. That's what she wants, so what exactly does he want? Then, the shocking development. Ohara asks her out. This is what she was asking him, right? Surely this is progress, right? Well, what anime have you been watching? Now, I'm not sure this was supposed to be as funny as I found it, but wow. Honjoji going completely silent for a bit isn't a surprise necessarily, and both of them internally freaking out is what we should have expected anyway. But to have that state go on, Honjoji just frozen and saying nothing for 10 minutes, while Ohara can't come up with any way to go forwards or backwards now that the whole thing's out there, even the cameraman doesn't know what to do. I mean, ordinarily the problem with socially inexperienced people circling around one another is how to get one or the other to move the relationship incrementally forward, to get small moments of connection that can build into something bigger. But I guess social inexperience can also mean you don't know how not to skip right to the finish line and shock the other person into this. The montage we got of Honjoji's entire love life, if you can call it that, is all we need to know that Ohara has done something 100 times more forward than anything else she has experienced before. And now, our instigator is passed out and missing the entire thing, which not only means that she can't break up the stalemate, she will have no idea the absolute chaos she just unleashed. I wonder which, if either, will fill her in on the night's events. Or, I guess the un-events. The real comedy coup de grace here is that nothing at all gets resolved. Honjoji won't break her stone face, and Ohara finally can't stand it and retreats with Nao. We got a confession in our romance story, the very thing that is usually a victory condition, and instead, I think they are more confused about their situation than ever. Now, obviously, if I'm watching a comedy, I want some laughs, and I certainly got my money's worth this time around. But more than that, I'm just impressed that this series has surprised me so much 2 weeks in a row. They've got me good at this point. So, episode 57. So much of this episode, and in retrospect, the preceding episodes, was setting up Subaru's speech to the population of Paristia. Last episode felt like a regrouping, a pause amid all the confusion that has gripped the group and city since the end of the premiere. Now, this episode will be about preparing a counterattack, about acting rather than reacting, and the first order of business is looking after the citizenry being assaulted by the Authority of Wrath in the sewers. And let me tell you, they totally got me. Not only me, I guess, but the experience of watching how this played out and what I was thinking or expecting during it, it's worth recounting a bit, because I'm kind of impressed. Firstly, I said last time that hopefully Subaru will realize he can put Liliana on the broadcast media. In fact, we started talking about that possibility in stream way back after the premiere, since her singing and Sirius's power show up in that episode and thus invite comparison. The broadcast media also had attention called to itself, so we knew it was going to be important, in the same way we could guess that the explanation of the control towers would eventually matter. So within this episode, after they know that broadcasting something to calm the city is the answer, they go through what seems like an exhaustive list of possibilities that are not Liliana. It seemed crazy that he wouldn't immediately seize on that idea, having just come from witnessing her efficacy. Emilia's message about where Coppola was located allowed them to immediately deduce that it probably wasn't the cultists who opened the Watergate. And so, how can you figure that out so quickly and not jump right to Liliana playing? I mean, she already has performed on the thing, back in the premiere, where she amusingly sings about Wilhelm's love life. So, okay, maybe it's a matter of expediency, and he's hoping someone who is actually on hand will work so they can take care of this and move on to the matter of assaulting all 4 towers at once. But while watching it, I started to feel like they were padding out the episode, that there was a specific place they wanted to end, and there wasn't really enough content to say or do to actually get there. Like the citizens in the shelters, I was losing faith. Why not skip right to the solution so obvious that we guessed it at the beginning of the season? But accompanying that thought, I knew that this was an extra long episode. 29 minutes and 29 seconds instead of the usual 23 minutes and 40 seconds. Almost 6 extra minutes. I don't know the logistics of extending episode length, but since I assume that it preempts some ad spots, it's probably not something you do without good reason. Whatever was happening was not padding. I was confused, and going by our stream chat, I was not alone. Having a more obvious solution, I didn't consider the notion of Subaru being the one to give some kind of heroic speech. And even when it's suggested, maybe I'm still a little skeptical. I'll spend some time trying to warn Subaru about the possible pitfalls of doing this, that he should perhaps just worry about Emilia and not take on all of this responsibility. We're going to come back to all that. When Subaru starts a little memory montage then, I'm still just kind of skeptical of what's happening. It's not even one of those quick flash montages that the series has done repeatedly, but at the end of it, with Al's words on one hand and his memories of struggle on the other, his reaction is, just business as usual then. And the casual, almost bored delivery in answer to Al's plea sells me on the whole idea. Watching it live, I just started laughing, and I said, no notes. No notes. So, now that I'm on board, let's talk about this speech. First of all, it's risky to show in full any kind of performance that is supposed to be impactful in universe. Like if we knew that someone's musical or dancing performance was show-stopping, then that can be enough to serve narrative purpose. It can happen off stage, and we can hear about it, and we accept it. But if you actually show a performance, there is a risk that it doesn't amaze the audience the way it does the characters, and now instead of accepting its impact, we are dubious. Speeches are similar territory. Short, inspiring ones or little monologues, not so much. But if you are going to suggest the well-being of a whole city rides on the success of a speech, and build up the reasons why a certain person should give it, and it's the main character of your series that's 57 episodes deep, well, you better deliver. And just like a song or dance, your mileage may vary, sure. But for my money, this was a roaring success. And the main reason is because the speech itself is so intimately tied up with the character of Subaru. I said last time that Subaru this season might be waking up to the realization that other people look at him differently than he looks at himself, that they want his input, they feel reassured when he is around. But because we've been riding along with him through all the failures they haven't seen, we understand why this is a hard thing for him to accept. The speech, then, is almost a path of Subaru's own evolving sense of self. He's unsure and fumbling at the beginning, doesn't know what to say, and says that instead. It's nervous energy in dialogue form more than any kind of argument or declaration. And not just in the words, but in the delivery, there is this uncertainty, a man who feels he is in over his head. He wants to run away. And in doing so, Subaru is closing the empathetic gap. The people in the shelters also feel this way, nervous and uncertain, overwhelmed. He may not literally be down there with them, but from the way he's expressing himself, he might as well be. A polished speech delivered with confident panache might work in some instances, but I dare say this is not one of them. It is, in fact, a good thing not to volunteer one of our practiced speechmakers for this particular task. Subaru haltingly sharing his stream of consciousness is relatable, and most importantly, it is authentic. People always respond to authenticity, to earnestness. Thus, when he turns the speech upwards, stating that he can't run away, well, that part also feels authentic. If he was uncertain like they were, but remains determined, is in fact looking upwards, facing forwards, then why not them also? Amusingly, when he was suggesting Kruge give the speech, he remembered the inspirational one she provided in the fight with the white whale. What he seems to forget, though, is that he was the subject of that speech, that someone as weak as him was still in the fight, so how could the rest of them do otherwise? The speech he delivers here is basically the same idea. Now, he does other things that are effective for speech making, such as the use of repetition and rhetorical questions, but the real climactic exclamation mark is the end, where he introduces himself as Natsuki Subaru, the guy who defeated the Sin Archbishop of Sloth. This nervous guy, who doesn't think he's good enough to address them, is the very one who delivered the witch's cult an exceedingly rare loss once already. To that point, he's just lifting their spirits and encouraging their defiance, but to sign off with something of substance like that will peg their optimism at its high watermark. Of course, in doing so, he defies both of the things that Al has warned him about. It's not careless on his part, it serves a purpose, but I fear it leads to grief all the same. However, that's the last thing we'll talk about. I'm warning you now, and will do so again then, that I have a speculation you might want to skip. If I'm right, you'll much rather want to see it happen than hear about it from some random YouTuber. Now, throughout, Emilia and 184 have a running conversation, split around Subaru's scenes, just like in the previous episode. And like before, this emphasizes how Emilia and Subaru are on the same page. 184 surprises Emilia after she returns to the room from her spying adventure, seemingly unable to contain her curiosity at why Emilia did not simply escape. Emilia gives us another example of how terrible she is at lying, and at least this episode's variety was humorous. In their discussion, Emilia is surprised to discover that 184 wanted her to escape, and maybe 184 is also surprised to realize as much. It turns out what she is most afraid of is that things will continue as they are forever. And after pointing out her smiling at the moment of death last time, I certainly believe her. Emilia's idealism is undaunted. Indeed, she even says she's never given up, and so tries to encourage 184 to do the same. But her reaction to this is almost hostile. Hope is something she will not dare. Hoping for a change that never comes is, perhaps, a much worse state than giving up. Optimism is dangerous, something to be warned against. A fall is more deadly from a greater height. In this way, 184 and Al are serving similar roles this episode, and we'll get to Al in a bit. Finally, 184 will share the horrible truth of her and the other wives' past, that Regulus killed everyone who knew their face or names. Indeed, giving them number designations after this is basically erasing them from the world. He is eating their names as surely as gluttony ate Rem's. Even Emilia must lower her head at this news, but that's basically a perfect cue for Subaru's speech to begin. Hearing it start from Emilia's point of view is another nice touch, and again echoes their connection despite their separation. But one character in particular connects them this episode, and so now it's time to talk about Al. I mentioned the mystery around him a bit last time, and this episode manages to give us insight and pile on further things to wonder at the same time. And honestly, this is pretty much how it always is in this series. During our Season 2 coverage, we started referring to this phenomenon as the lore hydra. Cut off one question, and two more grow in its place. Anyway, Subaru's question about how Al is in a fight is at least somewhat answered by the opening scene, where the resheathing of his sword suggests that he is responsible for the dead cultists around him. Of course, we only get to see the aftermath, keeping his real capabilities a mystery still longer. It appears as though picking up the dropped media was just opportunistic on his part, and connecting to Emilia a bit of serendipity. The conversation ends up being an interesting peek behind the curtains of Al's thoughts. Emilia is only thinking about the chance to get some information to Subaru, and racking her brain for whatever else she thinks might be useful. But she and Al have this kind of fractured conversation because Al has a particular idea about her situation and what he assumes is her mindset. And I'm delighted about this, really, because of the previous times I've talked about a potential damsel in distress situation with Emilia being kidnapped by someone who intends to forcibly marry her. I felt confident the series would do something besides just play it straight, and last episode answered that rather decisively, to my mind. Well, now we have Al, and he presumes that it's the standard trope situation. Thus, he assumes that the message she wants to give Subaru is that she's okay, and he assumes that she is worried about her situation and should be crying out for her knight to come rescue her. Even his analogy about a prince on a white horse falls flat, Emilia not understanding the reference. To me, this is a bit of winking at the audience. Our storyteller saying, in essence, see how the thing that might have looked like a trope has turned into something far from it? Why are you still doubting me this far into the story, you ingrates? On an in-universe level, though, we learn that Al expects Emilia to act this way, and seems to be bothered by what he perceives as her not treating the situation as seriously as she should. Like I said, He connects Emilia to Subaru this episode, and when he comes from one to the other to deliver her message, he is still in the same mode. He even uses the same failed analogy as a way to presage his report. And he expresses his concern to Subaru, I think expecting him at least to treat it like the knight rescuing Dansville situation that Al believes it should be. And later we'll learn that no, Subaru is not going to drop everything else to ride to her rescue. Now this is all the more amusingly ironic when you consider that Priscilla is his princess and seems like the last person who would play the damsel. Anyway, when Garf suggests that it be Subaru who gives the speech, the others are mostly in agreement, while only Al dissents. And at this point, I want to mention how we went about discussing Al on stream. This episode ends with one of those title screens that the last bit of dialogue plays over, as many episodes have. This time, the last bit of dialogue is delivered by Reinhard, who joins our anti-cultist party at the most crucial moment. His line is spoken over the episode title, The Newest of Heroes and the Most Ancient of Heroes, with part of the second hero kanji colored red. Since Reinhard is speaking and the Austreyas are red-haired, it may seem to imply that the ancient hero must apply to him, since Subaru is probably the newest hero. Now, Reinhard himself is an ancient, he's probably around the same age as Julius, but perhaps this is a reference to the Master Swordsman line. I know this hasn't been confirmed anywhere, but I expect that the Master Swordsman power is one of these covenant things, and I won't be surprised to learn that they are descended from the hero who helped seal Satila, with the help of the sage and the dragon, the story that Betty told us. So maybe that could explain the ancient hero. But what if instead the ancient hero is actually Al? Priscilla is red-themed, and Al wears a red plume in his helmet. He's so mysterious that it's actually conspicuous, and he knew things like Tifan's name, and that one shouldn't introduce themselves to gluttony. Even down an arm, he seems to have made short work of the cultists, but he also avoids fighting where the others can see, and wants to be known by an alias. Even in their discussion, he seems reluctant to share what he's thinking, and though he reacts to the conclusion that someone besides the cultists might have opened the Watergate, he doesn't own up to it. He'll even cluck his tongue in something like exasperation before sharing his opinion that the cultists don't care about their plans, that they have never lost and never think about losing. He seems to want to keep his head down, and what he says about the witch's cult, to me, sounds like the voice of experience. And so that, I think, may be what motivates Al this episode when he warns Subaru against assuming the role of a central rallying figure. That maybe Al himself was in such a role in the past, and it somehow went terribly wrong. He lost big to the cult, had his hopes betrayed, and now lives on in perpetual regret. The things he says to Subaru remind me of a lot of the advice that older generations give to the next, that is, the things they wish they could say to their younger selves. Like I said, he and 184 seem to have this in common. Terrible things happen to them, and now they think of hope as something dangerous, something to be avoided. Maybe he lost his damsel in distress. Maybe he follows Priscilla precisely because she seems so unlikely to ever need rescuing. Now, I will warn you again. I'm going to share speculation about the next episode. Unfortunately, I worked this out live on stream and couldn't put it back in the bag, but if I have guessed right, then I think you would be better served to experience it in the actual episode. I do enjoy speculating, because you have to collect a lot of information about the story to that point, and synergize it if you hope to make any kind of educated guess. But sometimes you can sort of accidentally spoil yourself and rob a moment of its surprise. So, if you weren't in that stream, and maybe just want to come back to this part after the next episode, this is your chance to bow out. Okay, so, this guess originates from 4 things. The conjecture about Al as the ancient hero of the title, the way Subaru goes against his warnings, thematic patterns in the season to this point, and the simple meta-reasoning of the next episode beginning a 2-month break in the series. For the meta-reasoning, splitting a season like this it's just really weird. And so I presume they have a particularly nasty cliffhanger to service and make a stew, champing at the bit to tune back in when we resume in February. Additionally, this episode seemed really hopeful and upward-facing, like a turning point in the story, but we're not even halfway. It certainly has to get worse first. And then there is Al's situation. By coincidence, we're discussing gluttony in Discord, but before the actual stream, and the nature of the erasing powers we've seen. We saw Kruge's memories get eaten, so she is walking around normally but has forgotten her past. Rem had her name and memories eaten, according to Puck, who suggests that people who have both eaten end up like she has, that they have become an empty shell. And so we were wondering, is there a third option? Could you have your name eaten but not your memories? Could you still be walking around like Kruge is, except that everyone else has forgotten you, has new memories to cover over the gaps that your absence would create? Thus, as we talked about Al as possibly some ancient hero, we remembered his warning to Subaru and thought maybe this too was the voice of experience. He does get bothered when Priscilla says his full name, after all. Was he some great hero of renown, a rallying point for others who carried the hope of many on his shoulders? And in that state, did he have his name eaten, collapsing whatever depended on him and his memory, reduced to an unknown, a faceless, nameless warrior? I even find myself wondering if he is the hero of the story, somehow still roaming the world as a knight-errant, determined not to risk the spotlight again. And imagining this, as he warns Subaru about assuming the role of a central hero figure, it occurs that the stakes of Subaru giving out his real name are suddenly much higher. This then ties into the thematic patterns. Like I pointed out last episode, this season has made a point of impressing on Subaru the impact and influence he has had on others. Liliana knows tales of his exploits. Wilhelm tells him his name has spread far and wide. Ricardo says he gives them the strength of 100. Kruge is reassured by his presence. Anastasia makes a point to have him around when they hold council, and basically all the stuff about why he should be the one to give the speech. Wilhelm even specifically talks about how Subaru sees things through by gathering others who cannot do things alone. Incrementally and incidentally, Subaru has ended up as the connecting point between so many powerful people. People who by all rights are rivals for the throne. When he makes the speech to further hold himself out as hope for the whole city, he has become the central tentpole holding all that optimism up. And so it seems to me, the most effective thing the Witch's cult can do would be to eat Subaru's name. How much cooperation collapses if that happens? How much despair is then returned to the people? What in the world will Emilia do if she forgets that Subaru exists? Al's warning about taking too much on yourself would be brutally, painfully borne out. It's even set up a little bit narratively. For unless Otto and Subaru have a quick debriefing, they won't realize that they ran into two different versions of gluttony. Roy might be the one in the tower, and they will thus think them all accounted for, only to have Lai roaming around somewhere to run into Subaru where they least suspect. And while I don't know exactly what Lai gets out of eating names or memories, his comments at the beginning of Season 2 seem to suggest that eating from those who'd done great deeds, like downing the whale, are an especially rich bounty. If so, then all the reasons that Subaru should give the speech are the same reasons that his name would be particularly delicious. One thing that really tilts me on this too is the example earlier with 184. Although it's not the same thing exactly, Regulus also kind of erases these girls' names, turns them into strangers to the whole world. That kind of echo is pretty interesting to only share right now, and especially since we have actually seen very little of Gluttony in comparison to the other archbishops, saving him for a particularly effective moment, mayhaps. Anyway, I don't want to start speculating on what that would mean, because we can do that if it actually happens. I do want to say that I don't think Subaru screwed up by giving his name in the speech. Sometimes you can do the right thing and still get a bad result. That is arguably what's going on with Emilia. Letting her join him against Sirius and fighting together is the right choice for them, even if it does lead to her kidnapping. The kidnapping is not a refutation of the choice, but a testing of it. If this happens then, it will be a similar situation. So, Girls Band Cry. I know this is not a currently airing show, like the rest of Casual Monday. This was the winner for the rewatch selection by the community. It originally released in spring of this year, but without a licensed streamer, which meant a lot of people missed it when it was live. Crunchyroll has picked it up now, though, basically just in time for this first round of selections. I will be viewing it for the first time myself, an episode each week, as though it were airing, and there's an accompanying dedicated channel in the Discord, which updates to the next episode each Tuesday. I will probably break these out into their own videos as well, since I'm going to be covering the whole thing, so if you're watching it in that form, Just know that it first comes out as part of Casual Monday each week. Alright, we won't do that prelude again. Hi, I'm Theta, and I'm about to talk about Girls Band Cry's first episode. This was quite the opening salvo, showing off its style, the ways it will handle the subject matter of music, its character dynamics, and its ability to evolve elements throughout the episode to echo its ideas. The opening sequence of Nina's travel headaches is an effective way to present her initial characterization, giving us the impression of someone in way over her head who nevertheless keeps on. She is a solo act for a bit as well, and the repeated misfortune that she shoulders sets us up to root for her, a lonely child trying her best to find her way. In fact, the episode as a whole has this rather persistent pattern of missing where one is supposed to be. Nina's misadventure in trying to get to her apartment is a series of arriving in the wrong place or arriving in the wrong condition or time. Overshooting, going the wrong direction, arriving too late, finding the apartment but with no way in, a misfire of a meeting with her neighbors, and to top it all off, she's not even living in Tokyo despite what she thought. She cannot seem to aim in the right direction, and was even aiming at the wrong thing. Along the way, though, we learn that she is herself somewhat aimless. She is not here in pursuit of a dream or anything specific. She is just leaving something she couldn't abide. Fleeing from, not charging toward. Thus, I want to point out the significance of the thing she does find on the first try, the spot where Momoko is busking. And though she is late if you go by when the performance started, she is, in a sense, exactly on time, arriving just as Momoko is singing the song that has become Nina's personal touchstone. That this will also be the very spot where the last scene plays out implies that, for Nina, this is the place she should be aiming toward. In fact, that song itself goes through something of an evolution throughout the episode. We hear the album version, what Nina is listening to, though faint, then Momoko's version, stripped to only vocals and guitar, and apparently the last time that she will sing the song, and because of that, Nina must sing the final version. Each of these successive performances is bigger than the one before, in a sense, and filled with greater emotion. The studio version is the polished, more sterile one. Momoko's version has perhaps a touch of her parting sadness for color, and then Nina's is full of her defiant energy. There's also a kind of line of succession. The studio album is by a version of Diamond Dust that no longer exists, and Momoko is performing it for the last time. For the song to live on, then, it must pass to Nina, for whom it is of great importance, the heir apparent to its message. This actually is one of those treatments of the subject of music that I liked in the episode. The idea that a song may mean different things to the artist and to their audience. Well, all art is that way, but music in particular tends to be more ambiguous about what it means, and is therefore more malleable for a listener. Now, they are better able to mold it around the way they see the world. And I rather relate to the idea of a song being particularly meaningful because it comes into your life at a critical or memorable time. There's a lot of songs that I associate with a particular period of my life, or events like breakups or vacations or moves. They resonated because of where I was, not because of what the songwriter intended. Thus, the song in question has an importance to Nina that Momoko cannot appreciate. For her, it was a song she let go of, believing that she could write another. For Nina, though, it was a kind of lifeline during a desperate part of her life that so far is only hinted at. Small wonder that this is the thing which shifts Nina out of her timidity, surprising Momoko with the contrast. As long as I'm talking about the episode's music, there's something else neat it kind of does, in addition to the evolving song. There's a few places where we get a little background music, like Nina's wandering around, but they aren't insert songs, nor are they properly a score. Instead, we have a solo guitar that sounds like someone just casually playing nearby. Not a song, but just freely playing. It gave me the sense of a setting peopled with distinct musicians, playing around but on their own. Of course, the more obvious thing it does with music is the way it is visually represented. When Nina first catches Momoko's opening notes, there is this narrowing of the visual information. It turns the scene to monochrome, save for the sound waves and Momoko herself. And then, as though they had real force, the impact with Nina shatters that hue-stealing facade around her. Even though she will go on to gush at Momoko about the song, we already know it means a lot to her because of that rendering. It's kind of wild to have a show don't tell moment about something that is actually heard, but it sure is effective. Similar creativity is on display in the final performance, where they actually change the lighting to heighten a sense of the unreal, or maybe the hyperreal. As the song goes on and Nina gets further into it, the world around her changes as well. The rain slows and eventually stops altogether, suspended in midair. And then those drops increasingly become suffused with color, until they are a variegated starfield, or a sky full of fireworks, or perhaps the gelled lights of a concert stage. This makes me think of the concept of the eternal moment, the way time can appear to slow to a crawl during especially impactful events. Nina gets so into the singing that for a time it's like she is constructing a whole world in there. In fact, no one is actually stopping to listen to this performance, as we constantly see the anonymous, umbrella-wielding crowd walk quickly in and out of frame. In this, too, I am reminded of the earlier idea, of how a song can mean something very different to its performer than to its audience. And then, as soon as the song ends, time resumes. The rain falls, the color dissipates, reality returns. One hopes, though, that Nina remembers the world inside the song, and the spirit that led her to it. On that note, let's talk about the middle finger. This bit and its evolving meaning is exactly the kind of storytelling flourish that people like me love to nerd out over. It's at first just a way to characterize them both, Momaka using it to provoke, and Nina not knowing what it meant. It's not the only example of Nina being sheltered, but adds a kind of innocent flavor to go along with her confusion with public transit and her singing of old songs. She thinks it must not mean what Momaka says based on the other group's reaction, but decides to trust her. That transforms it into comedy when she flips off the restaurant staff. This is an example of what I like to think of as Chekhov's punchline. Whenever an unusual detail is introduced in a story, in this case Nina's confusion and Momaka's false explanation, we in the audience are waiting for it to re-enter the tale in some way, a setup waiting a payoff. When it's used as a joke, like here, we naturally assume that it has served its purpose. We aren't looking for it anymore. But because that incident was a memorable slice of humanity shared between two strangers, Momaka will write it on the guitar as a parting thought. It comes back as a surprise, and this time it carries a note of sorrow, the potential friendship that will not be, laughter to sadness. But then it takes on its last meaning, which is actually its original one, defiance. Nina is out here in the big city without a dream, just in defiance of her status quo. Momaka is accepting the close of a dream, and Nina wants her to defy the return to her own status quo. And so Nina embraces this last meaning and goes searching for Momaka. And for some time, it seems, as it gets increasingly dark as we cut around to follow her, Momaka had said she was going to pick up her last check and then wait at the station for her train. But since she's still there so late, I like to imagine that she was watching train after train go by. As long as there was one more, she could put the decision off a little longer. Thus does Nina find her in the same spot. Even the other two musicians' presence was set up earlier in the argument over it being their spot, and they're the ones that precipitated the whole middle finger thing in the first place. Isn't that a neat trick? Lastly, since I intend to talk about every episode of this series, I thought I would do a scaled-down version of my usual 5 elements of analysis, the aspects of scene work that help efficient storytelling, a casual version, basically. Goals is up first, and is especially conspicuous in its absence. Nina has a goal of not losing, but we don't know what that means, and she has no dreams to chase as an alternative. Meanwhile, Momaka is actively putting down a once goal and offers no other. They are basically both in search of a goal. Because of that, perhaps their meeting will be what leads to finding one. In conflicts, the one they share is that money is tight. It's hard to live near Tokyo. Nina must find a job with no leads in a place she's known for one day, and Momaka seems to be giving up in part because music doesn't pay the bills. Outside of that, Nina has some kind of unresolved difficulty behind her. It's brief, but her phone call with her family and the story of why she had never had a beef bowl suggests an environment that didn't suit her. It's her sister who has called her repeatedly, and we get a visual cue to her mood in the way the room darkens, and these lines of tension spring out behind her. But it's not openly hostile, at least, and they've given her some money, so I guess it's complicated. This may be something she'll work through while here. Now, characterization basically is most of what we have discussed already, but in short, Nina is out of her depth and inexperienced and otherworldly, but obviously has enough gumption to go on this whole Hail Mary of a move. She can be rather fierce and stubborn wherever something she does care about is concerned, and Momoko gets to be on the receiving end of this multiple times. For her part, Momoko is flippant and mischievous, but taking Nina under her wing and giving away her CD for basically $1 kind of belies that image. Like in Goals, there is an absence here which is conspicuous. Momoko is spending her last night in town with a stranger, as though she has no one else who cares she is leaving. World building is next. It's about scene setting, really, the rules or circumstances that a story is constrained by. Nina's situation with her family or her hometown will belong here once we learn what it is. The hapless apartment in an unexpected part of town likely also matters at some later point, and perhaps too Momoko's suggestion that she get a roommate. Also, the fact that Nina can sing, presuming that at least the audio at the end was diegetic. Momoko has the past fight with the band, the splitting up and giving of the song rights. She was also in a living situation with a near stranger, and no one around her on her last day that she would rather see. Presuming that she stays in the story, being a songwriter and a guitarist also seems pretty relevant. Last then is theme. We certainly had a thread of defiance running through this episode, most obvious in the middle finger bit, but Nina's whole situation is steeped in this idea, the refusal to lose or stay the same. Momoko currently is basically in the opposite state, and that seems relevant. And so perhaps we'll have an exploration of how their two mindsets are in tension. Since she is almost like Nina herself, shifted in time, we might have tension between hopeful inexperience and cynical experience, different points on the same journey. At the least, that idea of aimlessness we talked about first is present for at least this episode, but I could see that being revisited, the importance of having a destination in mind. Certainly all the traveling and searching had symbolic meaning in addition to its plot relevance. We also begin and end the episode at train stations. For Nina, this is where her journey begins, and for Momoko, it's supposed to be where hers ends. They are, in theory, heading in opposite directions, something that is visually represented by the flow of traffic behind them in the bridge scene. But the fact that the place, which both begins dreams and can end them, it seems like an idea we might play with. Finally, that personal, maybe individual meaning of music, or maybe art in general, was a strong thread this time in the succession of the insert song. I'm still really struck by the contrast of the otherworldly final performance that is nevertheless ignored by the crowd. I hope that is one that we return to. This ends the first week of our rewatch. Episode 2 next time.